this video, we're going to go over type 1 and type 2 errors. So, unfortunately, when we do a hypothesis test, we are just testing a claim and we're basing our decision on data. So, our data is basically looking at the probability of something occurring by chance. So, we do have the possibility of being wrong. So, we're going to look at two types of errors that can happen once we make a decision. So there's four outcomes of a hypothesis test. The first one is we reject the null when the alternative is true. Okay, so let's see if this is a good outcome or a not so good outcome, and it's one of our errors. So it says we reject the null, so let me put that here, and it says the alternative is true. So I'm going to mark that. Now, if we reject the null, that means that we do have evidence for the alternative. So that's the one that we would state we do have evidence for. So let me go ahead and circle that. So it looks like we have evidence for the true claim. So that's a correct decision. Our second outcome is we do not reject the null when the null is true. So let me again go ahead and put this up. So it says we do not reject the null. So I'll put that up here when the null is true. So I'll put a T by the null. Okay, so if we do not reject the null, that means that we do not have evidence for the alternative, and that means that we would go back to our original claim, which is the null. Again, we've selected the true statement, so this is a correct decision. Number 3, we reject the null when the null is true. So we reject the null. Let me put that up here. When the null is true. So let me put a true up here. So if we reject the null, that means that we do have evidence for the alternative, or not that we do, but that's what our data actually finds, is evidence supporting the alternative claim. So let me circle that one. And notice that here we've found evidence for basically the untrue claim. So that is an incorrect decision, and that one we call a type 1 error, when we reject the null and the null is true. The last outcome is we do not reject the null when the alternative is true. So do not reject the null, the alternative is true, and we'll go back to our decision. If we do not reject the null, then that means that we did not have evidence for the alternative, and it means, again, we went back to our original claim, the null. So in this case, again, we had selected a claim that was untrue. So this is another incorrect decision, and we call this a type 2 error. Okay, so now we want to see, since we have two different errors, we're going to talk about minimizing both of these errors. So we have to figure out which one's worse, because we always want to minimize the worst type of error. So let's do a really extreme example. A person is on trial for murder. So we'll write the null and alternative. So the null, remember, is something that we assume to be true until proven otherwise. So in a court, you are innocent, and then what the court is trying to do is or the prosecution is trying to prove that you're guilty or show evidence to support that you're guilty. Okay, so now we have our two statements. So let's look at both types of errors, and then from these results, from this, again, extreme example, we can figure out which one would be worse. So a type 1 error, remember, that's when we reject the null when the null is true. So if we reject the null, that means that we would have evidence to support that we're guilty. So our verdict would be guilty, but again, when the null is true, it means the person is actually innocent. And we never really say innocent in a court of law, so we'll just put not guilty. For a type 2 error, we do not reject the null when the alternative is true. So if we do not reject the null, that means that we would have a verdict of, again, not innocent, but we would say not guilty when the person is actually guilty of murder. So now we have to figure out which one's the worst type. Both of them are bad. The type 1 error we have a verdict of guilty when the person's actually not guilty, so we're sending an innocent man to jail. And then type 2 error is not guilty when the person is actually guilty, so we're letting basically a guilty person go free. So they're both really bad, but type 1 error is a little bit worse because if we have somebody accused of a crime and sent to jail when they're actually innocent or not guilty, that means that the actual guilty party is still out. So you're sending an innocent man to jail, and on top of that, we actually have the guilty person going free. Okay, so let's talk about, well, what does this have to do with our significance level? So the definition is the level of significance alpha is the probability of making a type 1 error. And the probability of making a type 2 error is called beta. So because this type 1 error is worse, we want to minimize that probability of creating that error. So we want to minimize alpha. Unfortunately, as we decrease alpha, we decrease that probability of a type 1 error, we actually increase beta, which is the probability of making a type 2 error, and vice versa. So if we minimize beta, we increase alpha. So we need a nice balance where we set alpha at a reasonable level for our situation. Again, we just did a really extreme example, but if we were talking about, you know, filling peanut butter jars under what they stated, that would not be as bad as sending an innocent man to jail. So we just want to set alpha at a reasonable level so we don't end up making that type 2 error too large.